Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm Sarah Gibbon. I'm based here in anthropology, medical anthropology, and I'm really delighted to be able to welcome you to this special event here tonight in the anthropology department at UCL. It's hosted by SHS Health, Mind and Society and also the Grand Challenges funded Anthropocene Sustenance project. So we're really delighted to be able to welcome today Emily Yates Doerr, a leading anthropologist whose research on food and nutrition has and continues to have, I think, significant impact in and far beyond anthropology. And so just briefly, by way of background, Emily gained her PhD in sociocultural anthropology from New York University, and it was this and subsequent work which formed the basis for her first book, The Weight of Obesity, Hunger and Global Health in Post-War Guatemala, published by University of California Press in 2015. Emily recently completed an ELC grant on maternal health interventions at the University of Amsterdam and is currently based at the anthropology department at Oregon State University. So we're here tonight to learn and to be in discussion with Emily about her latest book publication entitled Malnutrition, Maternal Health Sciences and the Reproduction of Harm, published this year by University of California Press. So I think many of us are aware and have benefited from the scope of Emily's work, which spans, I think, 2 decades of research in Guatemala. Is that right? More or less, yeah. And which has been instrumental, I think, in foregrounding the complex politics of health as this relates to food and nutrition. So we're really delighted to have you here and to continue these discussions and to hear about the new book. So welcome, Emily, and over to you.
So, can people online see me?
They can see you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me here, and to the Health, Mind and Society group. Thank you, Anne and Cicely, in advance for engaging with my work. We're here for this book launch, but also so that I can participate as a discussant in the Embodied Ecologies project. And I wanted to add a special note of gratitude for the funding that supports large-scale anthropological collaborations, such as UCL's Grand Challenges of Cultural Understanding grant. Watching funding sources collapse in the US right now. I could say more about that, but I just want to be like a canary in the coal mine to kind of say this has happened really fast and do what you can to support networks of solidarity that might continue to kind of keep grant funding alive where you can. We can talk more about that. My book is mostly based on research that was carried out between 2015 and 2017, but it's been much longer in the making. At the end of the research that I did for my previous book, which was about the emergence of the diagnosis of obesity in Guatemala, this was in the early 2000s, I noticed a shift in how many global health workers were responding to metabolic illnesses. Instead of treating these illnesses in middle-aged patients, they were discussing preventing them from developing in the future by targeting women of reproductive age with improved nutrition. They spoke of maternal nutrition as future healthcare, signaling that there was a critical window of development in early life that would shape human fitness long into the future. At this time in the early 2000s, the interest was becoming codified into a powerful United Nations priority known as the first 1,000 days of life, or the window of 1,000 days, which is the time period that from conception, this is their terms, until a child is roughly 2. It's a time period that the growing fetus or growing baby, depending on who you're talking to, is fed through the mother's body. The WHO recommends that breastfeeding lasts about 2 years. So that's the 1,000 days conception until that kind of cessation of breastfeeding. And I just wanted to kind of note the works of Michelle Pentecost, Fiona Ross, Lenore Manderson, Alejandro Colom, and others who've studied this global priority. Lots of anthropologists out there looking at this. Much of my book is situated in Guatemala, but it also moves to sites where policy agendas are advanced and adjusted. So I went to the 2014 International Congress of Nutrition in Rome, that was held at the FAO headquarters. I went to the UN's Sustainable Development Goal launch at the, they did a number of these, but one of them was at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle. I actually went to a series of conferences at the Birkbeck College in here that aimed to integrate agriculture and health, where this policy was discussed, and so on. The movement across place reflects that I wasn't primarily studying, I wasn't doing a classic ethnography of a place and its people, but rather I was doing this ethnography of a global policy, and that a large part of my work was to track the circulations of this policy from its unique formation in Guatemala into global health centers and then back into Guatemalan life. In the book, I call the vignettes, where I present these global circulations, historias, which I draw from the anthropologist Luisa Reyes Castro to play with the crossover between history and storytelling. And as she explains, this work of telling historias isn't just past-facing historical work, but also world-building work. In the opening, the opening historia, one of the openings, there's several openings to the book, but I describe a longitudinal study that underpins the first 1,000 days policy. Between 1969 and 1977, a team of scientists fed supplemental nutrition to thousands of women and children in 4 Guatemalan communities. The scientists were funded by a grant from what became the U.S. National Institutes for Health to study the linkages between better nutrition during childhood and long-term impacts on human development. In 2 of the communities, they set up feeding stations containing a drink of vitamins and sugar water that they called fresco. In the other 2 communities, the stations contained a thick protein powder prepared with sugar and dry skim milk that they called atol. Okay, that's that one. And they formulated this atol for the study, and then it's become popularized and sold throughout Guatemala today. For nearly a decade, this is in most of the 70s, the scientists offered people in the 4 communities unlimited amount of either fresco or atol, and they set up these stations where people could drink twice daily. And the scientists recorded what the amount the pregnant and nursing women consumed, and then they recorded children's consumption. Actually, they recorded the consumption of everyone, but they've really focused on the consumption of women and children in their data. They also measured the bodies of babies involved in the study, and as they grew, conducted IQ tests on them. The randomized decision about which 2 of the 4 communities drank protein and which 2 drank fresco would allow the scientists to assess the outcomes of consuming the high protein drink. The results of the study showed that babies of the protein communities performed better on tests they were given, helping to cement the equation of these highly commercialized protein supplements with better nutrition, a proxy movement that has widespread effects in Guatemala and worldwide. So my book is an afterlife of this study. Mal in Spanish, as in its Latin root, has a double meaning: incorrect or wrong, and evil, cruel, or causing harm. Typically, when people speak of maternal malnutrition, they're thinking about the first sense of mal. So malnutrition is a condition where a woman hasn't had the proper diet, and as a result, her nutrition is inadequate or incorrect. I write the term with a hyphen to slow down this association and thereby open up the possibility that the second root of mal is in play. Malnutrition, the title of the book, suggests that the problem that rural Guatemalan women face has less to do with an inadequacy of their bodies than with a frequently harmful orientation of the field of nutrition. Much as Vandana Shiva has used the term maldevelopment to describe how the field of development destroys and dispossesses as it portends to save, malnutrition describes the practice of making people hungry in the name of health. In my analysis of the longitudinal study, I present a critique of nutritionists' and anthropologists' theories of structural violence or embodied violence, which too often leaves us with the idea that violence produces deficient bodies. And this was something that ran counter to women's own sense that hardship might make them stronger. What I show throughout the book is how understandings of embodied deficiency often reproduce the same racist hierarchies of value that theories of structural violence claim to be working against. And it presents a cautionary tale of how this term of structural violence or embodied deficiency can be reproduced with harmful effects. Social reproduction is a major theme of the book. Many of the people I describe, including anthropologists, seem to be working to transform, to improve harmful structures, but their practices frequently wound up holding these structures in place. Throughout the book, I draw on Sarah Ahmed's theory of non-performativity. She looks at the work of university diversity committees to show how the performance of change, in fact, reifies systems of power, preventing change from happening. In the book, I try to pay empirical attention to the reproduction and transformation of broader political and cultural systems of power. And of course, change presents this very vexing temporal problem. How far out do you need to look to know if systems are repeating themselves or if there are breaks in the cycle? Rather than resolve the problem, it's one I try to make visible in my writing. It troubles me, and it's one that I want to trouble my readers too. The book is written in part for idealistic global health students who have not yet questioned ways that global health programs are complicit in harm. And if I were when I speak about the book in for my undergraduate or public health students, I think that one of the takeaway messages that I want them to leave with is to kind of consider when they're thinking about nutrition. I want them to think about three kinds of sovereignty that are often undermined by nutrition science and policy. One of these is reproductive sovereignty. I show how women's own bodily and reproductive autonomy is often lessened by maternal nutrition programs that increase surveillance and monitoring of their pregnancies. So, I want students to ask, anytime, we speak of nutrition, we should be thinking is this supporting or lessening women's reproductive sovereignty? Okay, another sovereignty, land sovereignty. The reliance on ready-to-eat foods on the part of development organizations like USAID undercuts feeding and farming practices, which are deeply connected to people's relations to community and land. So this Incaparina supplement here has all kinds of destabilizing effects on broader feeding and family making and kin making practices. So again, the kind of similar strategy there of, if nutrition is in place, ask, is this supporting or undermining land sovereign movements for land sovereignty? And a final one, the third kind of sovereignty term would be border crossing sovereignty. If development agencies like USAID genuinely cared about people, and this is, again, this argument that I put forth in the book, if they cared about the people they target with these programs, they would make it easier for Guatemalans to cross borders to be with kin, many of whom have traveled to the US to produce factory foods. That these organizations discursively discourage migration. Often the programs are kind of set up to stop migration. It signals how far out of touch many of the programs are with the communities that they claim to be helping. And early in the book this is just a photograph of people waiting in line for these nutrition supplements. But early in the book, I start with this horrific story of a 20-year-old woman, Claudia Gomez Gonzalez, who's shot at the US border by a border patrol guard. She's from one of the communities where I studied the unfolding of the first 1,000 days intervention. It's a community where the intervention has been powerful for the last 15 years or so. And she's a 20-year-old woman. And her death solidified to me the degree to which policies proclaiming to care about women's lives didn't really care about them in terms that mattered to them. The book is full of these kind of seeming ironies, which I argue aren't actually irony, but cruelties orchestrated by systems that want to encourage political and economic subservience. It's precisely because Guatemalan women are strong and skilled community builders that their activities have been targeted both by military violence and the violence of a healthcare system that works to teach women that they are ignorant, malnourished, that they don't know how to care properly for their kin and communities. But while my book is full of stories of cruelty, each chapter also has openings that build on fieldwork with people who are working to change systems so that they can be otherwise. These include Guatemalan scientists who are working to uplift Indigenous voices in their science, Guatemalan mothers who are working to remake the space of politics through feeding practices, and Guatemalan USAID workers who are working to remake the institution from within. So, I haven't worked this all through, but I did want to talk. It's a strange thing to have published a book that is so critical of USAID's history at the exact time that the institution is being so violently dismantled. And I think after 63 plus years in operation, that it might have officially ceased its operations at the start of this month. It's a little confusing because things are held up in court, but if you go to the webpage, it hasn't been active for quite some time. During Trump's first presidency, he made terrible cuts to a USAID-funded program that I was studying that left real people I know well, people that I care about, to suffer. And I write about some of these effects in the book. For example, an Indigenous health promoter whose very meager salary that was USAID funded was cut in 2017, leaving to her to feel that she had no choice but migrate to the US. She, like others with USAID funding in the region, had been working on sustainable development projects that included building goat pens, organic gardens, and greenhouses. And many of those employed by USAID in Guatemala were Guatemalans who have been very committed to social and democratic reforms. So the elimination of the program certainly has been felt hard by people. This is, not written in the book because this is happening now, other than the 2017 programs, but it's been felt very hard by people that I worked with for the book. And USAID was also a flawed institute. And there is some hope that the end of the agency will have some positive outcomes, not for any of the reasons that Trump's politicians are saying, but because it will allow for greater autonomy from people in Guatemala to design and develop their own forms of mutual aid, if not USAID style aid. So I wanted to, just in concluding, I wanted to share that roughly a year before my book was published, I led a workshop at the University of Amsterdam that was kind of sincerely titled Why Write Books, where we debated the pros and cons of book authorship. And many of the people in the audience were public health scholars who tend to write articles. And I have to say that when the discussion concluded, it felt like something of an open question, whether the time to produce the long form argument of a book was worth it. And I did write this book when my kids were screen schooling with COVID lockdowns. And I asked myself all the time, like, is this like, there's kind of crisis around me, and is this slow form of writing, a good and effective use of my time? A year later, with my book in hand or sitting on that table over there, I feel more confident in the merits of book writing than I did then. One of the great virtues of the book is that you have space for challenging and nuanced arguments where goods and bads can fold together in complex ways, where institutions like USAID, much like the field of anthropology or the academy more generally, can be harmful and can be made to be otherwise, where it doesn't have to be either or, but can be and, or where sometimes it can be either or, and sometimes it can be and, where those kinds of multiplicities of mattering can materialize in the text. In my book, I cite anthropologists Dana Ein Davis and Krista Craven, who describe attention as one of our most powerful tools. It's quite a privilege, and potentially a disappearing privilege, to get to write books and to also find people who continue to make time to read them. I began with acknowledgements, and I want to end there too. There is a powerful and unsettling politics to asking for book length attention at a time of crisis. So thank you for sharing that attention with me in the discussion that will follow today.
A little flavour for the richness. So there is this coffee circulating. That's great. So what we thought we'd do now is have some comments, and we're very fortunate. We've got two willing and commentators with us tonight. But also online, I should say that you will have the ability to ask questions later in the chat. So people who want to ask questions, please put them in the chat. But let's invite both our commentators. Sorry, so have a seat. Yeah. Yes, I should. And Emily also. You're not using slide. So, well, I'll introduce Cicely. So we're very fortunate to have Cicely Marston, who is Professor of Public Health at the Nuffield Department of Primary Healthcare Sciences at the University of Oxford.
Thank you. I've got my notes on my phone just in case it looks like I'm checking my WhatsApps. Didn't have a way of printing them out. So, yeah, so I mean, I love the book. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. So if you haven't read it, I really strongly recommend it. Really good. I just wanted to give a little bit of my background just so that you know where I'm coming from with my comments. So I did my PhD fieldwork in Mexico City, and I spent a year in Mexico working in a community on the borders of Mexico City where there was a lot of extreme poverty, a lot of street violence. And as a result of that experience, met a lot of people who then crossed into the US for work and were very poorly treated in that crossing. So I became really interested in this as well. I've mostly done my work in sexual and reproductive health. And one of the projects I did was in Nepal in about, it's kind of around the time of the big earthquake in 2017, 2018, that sort of time. I was actually working in Nepal for a few years, and that's the only time I'd come across the 1,000 days kind of thing, and I was kind of a bit perplexed by it because I was actually evaluating a program. That's why I was there. I'll say a bit more about it in a minute. And then there was this 1,000 days thing, and everyone was like, "Oh yeah, the first 1,000 days." And I was saying, "Well, everyone seems to know what this is, and I'd never heard of it before." Anyway, and I learned an awful lot about what it was from reading the book, because I was like, "Oh, it's something to do with nutrition and something." Anyway, so I wish I'd known then. I now know about it, because I would have done a lot more digging about what that actually meant. So at my project, and I thought I would reflect on some of the things in the book that really spoke to me. So much richness in the book. These are certainly not the key points of the book. These are just the ones that I just want to bring out now. But one of the things that was very striking was the kind of way that it shows very clearly how individualizing structural works. So how mothers are basically born societal ills in this case, and some of my work. I was also really interested in discussion in the book about proxies and how proxies are used. So, for instance, a proxy measure for kind of poor nutrition, stunting, and then you have this kind of actual quantitative measure that's supposed to indicate all of these things that have happened in the background. There is quite, there's more discussion of proxies in the book, but it really made me think a lot about how we do evaluations in public health and the kinds of proxies we use. And there are a lot of these things that are already troubling. So there's that. And then also about the stranglehold of randomized controlled trials on things like evaluations in public health, and how that, and the way that that is kind of the way that the proxy measures the kind of the ideas about sort of simple linear trajectories between an intervention and outcome can play out. And so, I mean, the trial that you just described, where they give people sugary water, I mean, that's an astonishing thing to give as a kind of control. I mean, it's sort of, given what we know now about sugary drinks, and I mean, it's kind of, I wonder if they knew at the time and just didn't care, or whether it was just considered as a neutral thing to give. But anyway, so one of the things I thought, I just wanted to sort of give us a flavour of how that stuff has played out in my work, because obviously the book particularly looks at nutrition, but it has this very, very broad scope, and it's kind of epic actually in its kind of scale. And when I was in Nepal, the reason I was there was because I was asked to evaluate a family planning program. And the reason I agreed to do it was because I spend a lot of time complaining about how badly people do evaluations. And I thought it was probably about time I got my hands dirty and actually did one, because I would then understand why people do it so poorly. And it did work. I understood a lot better. I'd like to say that mine was not really rubbish. Not of them are. But one of the things that immediately became obvious was that there was this push to frame the intervention that I was looking at was to give an education set of sessions to female community health volunteers. And in Nepal, those are, I think they might receive a small stipend, but they're basically volunteers, and they're known as FCHVs, which is another thing. There's this thing about language. FCHVs in Nepal are actually called FCHVs, like using those letters in English, even though most people speak English. So anyway, that's sort of by the by. But the idea was that they would be educated to give family planning information, so information about contraception to kind of villagers. And because the FCHVs all have their patch, and they need people to go and weigh the babies when they're born, that kind of stuff. So the idea was you'd give them information about contraception, and then they would give it to the women communities, and then the women would all be able to use contraception. There was a sense from the program that there was a problem with communities that were particularly marginalised. So the idea was to target, for instance, there's a Muslim minority near the border. There were a couple of Dalit people in the country, and I can't remember, there were a couple of other groups of people who were considered to be marginalised and in need of these kinds of interventions. Anyway, I was working with Nepali colleagues, and so I sort of said, well, what's your sense of why people are not using contraception? Because the fertility rate in Nepal is actually pretty low. So I think, well, how are they getting so few? How are they having so few babies if they're not using contraception? And it was like, well, it's about contraception. So that was the first thing. So it was like, well, why has this program been developed to educate women about contraception they already know about? And I was sort of saying, well, is it that they only know about one method, or what's going on? Like, why is there this idea? My Nepali colleagues would go, no, we're constantly sent out to ask people to name contraceptive methods, and they always can. And so there's this whole kind of thing right from the start about where does this even, like, what is happening? And like just this kind of construction of these women as very ignorant and entirely kind of responsible for their kind of failure to take up modern methods of contraception. So it was already a bit kind of like, I don't know how I'm going to design an evaluation around this completely ridiculous concept. The program was going ahead regardless, by the way. I didn't have any say in whether it actually happened or not. And so, I mean, it was that thing of like, well, why are you putting all the responsibility for everything onto first of all, onto the FCHVs, who, by the way, were often barely had any schooling. So they couldn't necessarily easily take in the information they were being given and then kind of regurgitate it in a way that wasn't quite convoluted. So there was, anyway, skipping ahead quite a long way. One of the issues was that there was one of the things that I was thinking about a lot when I read the book was the fact that evaluations often don't consider harms at all. So in a kind of classic public health evaluation, there's an assumption that either it will be, that there will be, no effect, which is a kind of a sense that there's it's neutral, or that there will be a positive effect. But there's rarely an attempt to show that there'd be a negative effect. Now, if you're doing a drug trial, you'll have stopping criteria. So it's like, okay, enough people have died now that we have to stop giving this drug. But in a trial of an FCHV intervention, there's no stopping criteria because there's an assumption that it will be good, right? You just give people information and then they give it, and it might be well done and it might not be well done, but there's no sense that it's dangerous. And what we found was that, well, first of all, as I already said, it was completely pointless intervention in the first place because the people that they were supposed to be informing already knew information. But the other was that the FCHVs were actually going around saying to people, don't use hormonal methods. They're terribly bad for you. They'll make you infertile. You should use this new method that I've learned about, presumably from USAID sources, which is this kind of rhythm method thing where you abstain from sex every, they don't have that as as part of the kind of repertoire, particularly, not that I found out. And so this was a kind of new news for them. And so they were coming off these hormonal methods, which were reliable and stop pregnancy, and going on to rhythm method, which doesn't. And so we interviewed one woman who had basically done that and then got pregnant and had an abortion, which luckily was available locally through a US funded provider, IPAS, which is not. So anyway, there's another thing about thinking about the kind of cut in all the services now. A lot of those services were available through foreign funding. So even though you've got these, it's the same thing. You've got these problems in the way that the conception works. The actual physical abortion services may or may not be there now. So someone who needs an abortion may be able to get one. Anyway, and then in terms of the proxies, so in the way that stunting was a proxy for undernutrition, there's contraception measures which are used on a global scale. So uptake of modern methods of contraception is a kind of standard way of assessing the success or otherwise of your contraception programming. And I was actually I'd just come from a meeting. I'm on a UNFPA technical advisory group, and they're trying to develop measures of reproductive autonomy and agency rather than using this method of, have you got modern contraception or not? And I mean, it's kind of getting there very late, but there's a whole program of work called FP 2030, which may or may not exist anymore. I'm not sure actually whether these things even are happening now. But there's been talk since at least the 90s of how if you have uptake of modern contraception as your success measure, you might end up coercive because people want to get their numbers up. So that's always been considered a bad measure of success. And yet it's in FP 2030 measures, even now. So we're talking about from the 90s to potentially 2030, there's been this concern and absolutely nothing whatsoever done about it. And we know that there are loads of coercive. Anyway, so, I mean, I don't know if it's at all clear why I'm talking about this in relation to the book, but except to say that it's, I suppose I was thinking about it in terms of these proxy measures being potentially harmful. The way that people are constructed is very stupid and ignorant, and that's what the problem is. What we discovered was leaving aside the fact they actually were using contraception quite a lot of the time, the reason they weren't using contraception was often because they would go to the services and then they'd be turned away on spurious grounds. So they'd come to the service and say, please will you give me an injectable? And they'd say, are you within the first 5 days of your menstrual cycle? And they'd say no, and then they'd be sent away, which is not a thing. You should just have it. And so and then obviously the providers weren't necessarily there, the commodities weren't in stock. There were loads of reasons why they weren't getting the methods. People were using methods even though they had terrible side effects because they were desperately trying not to get pregnant. So none of these women were ignorant that we spoke to. They all knew about different methods. They often had used them. They'd had terrible experiences with them, but they still carried on using them. And so it's just this I suppose it just really rang true that what you write about in the book has that kind of all of those dimensions to it. And then the other thing I really liked about the book is the temporal aspect and the historical aspect, because that's another thing that in public health we consider far too infrequently, that all of these things have a backdrop of potentially huge harms that have been done to communities by other communities, that they might not actually want to use whatever it is you've suddenly turned up with, that injection you've suddenly turned up with. They might not be very keen. Anyway, so in my own work, I try to look at how we can kind of take account of a lot of this kind of thing, particularly things like the way that people are framed as ignorant and in need of assistance. But I definitely will be coming back to the book and looking more, because there's so many things in it that I think will be really useful for me in the future. So, now that's enough from me, but I would just like to really thank you as well for so much food for thought and a really astonishing piece of work.
Very much, Cicely. I think what we'll do is kind of have both comments and then allow Emily to respond. So second commentator tonight is Professor Anne Kelly, who is a medical anthropologist based in the Anthropology Department.
Thank you. It's such an immense privilege to be included in the launch, really this momentous book, and you got a flavor of that from there. So, like all of Emily's work, it's already provided a huge source of inspiration for how I think about research, and also to teaching. And I'm going to say a little bit just about what, as a resource in a kind of medical anthropology program, this book is. So as Emily kind of nicely set out, it is a powerful and really challenging ethnography of a policy, and it's meticulously crafted text, empirically rich and theoretically sophisticated. But also, and I really want to emphasize this, is an act of critical circumspection, empathetic imagination, and intellectual solidarity. So I'm really trying to offer my reflections in that spirit, kind of intellectual kinship, but also with a lot of humility. I'm not an expert in maternal health in Latin America, Emily does a really good job in the book of kind of pulling out what we need in Americas in food studies, or even kind of in the technical fields of epigenetics or fetal development, that the book really kind of launches its critique. But I have spent a career working in interdisciplinary departments and conducting fieldwork in contexts shaped by biomedical research, disease control interventions, and kind of policy experiments like the ones that Emily describes. And I really kind of was struck by the sensitivity with which this book navigates this highly fraught encounter between global health and development, kind of marking out there, and really this kind of securitized humanitarian biomedicine. So really only having very recently taken up this position in an anthropology department, helping as part of this brief is to really help lead this medical anthropology master's program and think where it's going. I really was grateful for the orientation that the book provides in thinking through the roles and responsibilities field. I'm claiming you as medical anthropologists who do many things to that, but I'm stealing you for that. To kind of how do we think about the questions of health and the inequalities that underpin kind of that distribution of health. So that's the contribution I want to highlight here. Really what malnutrition has to say about medical anthropology, the other things, and what it tells us about the stakes of our work today. So medical anthropology is a wide range of paradox. At its core, it emerges from our shared human confrontation with illness, suffering, and mortality. It is a field of inquiry uniquely equipped to document distress, not only as it is felt and narrated, but also how it is produced. Medical anthropologists seek to offer ethnographic depth and analytic clarity about the tangled causes of harm and the institutions that claim to ameliorate it. What gives medical anthropology its force, I would argue, is its power to problematize, reframe issues that are too often reduced to the binary of life and death. In doing so, it expands the range of solutions to these problems, air quotes, and the constellation of actors who are best placed to deliver them. We problematize from a position of epistemic humility or modesty, giving priority to the knowledge of those who are affected by those problems. That humility is paired with a communicative urgency, a drive to make our findings legible beyond the academy, to develop registers, be they spatial, textual, visual, or embodied, through which suffering and its conditions can be sometimes even transformed. Because we work in the space, really a difficult space between critique and care, between kind of interference and collaboration, medical anthropologists must continually grapple with what is the purpose and consequences of their research, whether in improving the quality of care or in opening our political imaginations towards more just futures. Paul Farmer famously described medical anthropology as the art of attending to suffering, a practice that, like medicine, is ultimately about care. Our best ethnographies, then, are genuinely careful. They attend to harm without instrumentalizing it. They bring into view the solidarities and forms of conviviality that persist in the aftermath of death, tragedy, violence. Now, Emily has long exemplified, and I would say really epitomized, that form of ethnographic attentiveness. And malnutrition, this kind of meticulous attention is everywhere in how she writes, how she reads, how she inhabits the field. We are with her through doubt, difficulty, and the ethics of her encounters. And it is moving, if not at times really challenging and heartbreaking, but it is also methodologically and politically generative. As Emily said, the book opens with the story of Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez, a 20-year-old Maya Mam woman who, pregnant and unarmed, was shot in the head by a border guard in 2018. Her death became this kind of salacious political spectacle. As Emily accounts, this kind of gets through media and social, it's kind of posted, there's a Wikipedia page, folded into this kind of public reckoning with the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy. But malnutrition insists on a deeper reckoning. Emily's ethnographic return to Claudia's grave, Julia and their children, the book refuses to let that death remain a media event. It is reframed through another, less visible loss, that of Victoria, also a young Maya Mam and pregnant, who died of dehydration while crossing the desert, a death unfilmed, untold, unmourned outside her community. And it's also made real because Emily's empathy of recalling her own extreme thirst when she was pregnant kind of brings that what is thirst in the desert, pregnant. So this is not simply a re-narration of individual tragedy. It is an unflinching, empathetic account of how maternal death and the maternal body are made into instruments of policy, sites of governance, collateral damage in the reproduction of empire. The opening vignette sets the terms. This is not a book merely about maternal death, health, and nutrition. Instead, we're asked to examine how categories life intervention in the first 1,000 days become scaffolds for state and corporate violence and really barricades for a meaningfully better future, or flows through this kind of odd speculative logics of biological potential and human capital. Their exquisite ethnographic detail and the truly generous, if at times bracing honesty with which she situates herself and her body in the text, Emily shows us how interventions that claim to support maternal health in Guatemala are bound up with the reproduction of poverty, the securitization of borders, and the responsibilization of women, which we're so elegantly talking about for the future they are denied. So I'm going to just flag out two quick anecdotes from the story, which I think really, from the book, that really illustrate this practice that Emily presents. So the first comes when Emily enrolls herself in a weaving class with the Maya Mam women. Another U.S. expat, Eliza, joins her, and in kind of defiance of what she sees as these patriarchal norms, she announces that she will weave, not Eliza, not Emily, her pants before weaving those for her husband. Now, her act of this kind of feminist assertion backfires because the pants turn out all wrong, they're misshapen, they're ugly, they're badly stitched together, and her teacher, unimpressed, remarks, says, "I told you the man's pants should come first." So it's both a moment of humor and humility, but also a profound critical insight. The story doesn't dismiss feminist commitments, but it asks us to consider what forms of dignity, virtuosity, and authority might be at play in practices that, from a liberal Western perspective, appear oppressive or misguided. And it invites us to attend to power and agency as they are lived, not assumed. Now, as my medical anthropology students astutely noted, it's not the story itself, but the situated of the ethnographer that captivates, provokes, and challenges. This form of ethnographic commitment, deeply reflexive, opening to that models the kind of reproductive solidarity needed in implementation, ecological collapse. Second story comes at the very, very end of the book. Emily is recovering from a hysterectomy, anemic. She's been prescribed iron supplements, which kind of set off at this, bring us back to the start of the chapter where she's talking about kind of iron supplements paired with a kind of political iron fist. Her friend Carla, who's living with diabetes, suggests an alternative, a broth of liver, onions, tomatoes, and watercress, which sounds really good. I was like, that sounds great. The anecdote recalls the start of the book, kind of the vulnerabilities of the maternal body. And it has, in some interesting ways, all the hallmarks of kind of a classic medical anthropology engagement, kind of an indigenous remedy, an alternative to this pharmacon of biomedicine and its kind of capitalist toxic afterlives. Emily doesn't focus on the efficacy of the soup. What matters is the active care through it is offered. Carla calls her every day in the hospital, extending advice rooted in kind of generations of women's nourishment practices. So the focus shifts from the substance, iron or soup, to the social situated and generational practices through which it is offered. Nourishment, he writes, entails a collective commitment to caring for the connection of bodies. I think this is where the book leads us, with a kind of reimagining of critique, what critique can do, not as a dialectics of interrogation, deconstruction and exposure, kind of explanatory logic, so but as a kind of weaving, stitching, a collaboration, kind of working and holding together. Malnutrition is not only about the violence as a policy, science, and development, but at the possibilities of relation, intimacy, survival, and the ethics of a company. So at the risk of being trite, and I know, Emily, we already referenced this, we are living in wildly uncertain times. As researchers, whether it's social, scientific, natural, we are operating at what Lorraine Daston once called ground zero. She was speaking about COVID-19, the kind of cascading uncertainties of an unknown pathogen. But it's also that feeling of ground zero, I think is also felt in terms of our scientific ethos and mission, right? So the pandemic made it harder to voice certain critiques, of which I have been quite comfortable as a kind of anthropologist in global health, the fallibility of metrics, the violence of evidence-based interventions, without seeming reckless, right? All of a sudden it was like, what am I saying in COVID? And now, as long as we are no more clear or kind of stable in the position of my critique, the collapse of humanitarian norms, the rise of nationalist populism, the weaponization of maternal imagery and rhetoric, the disappearance of this kind of cosmopolitan conviction. J.D. Vance has this invocation of ordo mortis, right, as in contrast to like what we think of the family, have really only deepened that sense of impasse of what are we doing. So what can medical anthropology offer now? What does it mean to do critique when the soft powers we once thought to expose have curdled in this kind of overt repression? Emily doesn't give us a programmatic answer, but she does offer a method. Attend to care, even in its most compromised forms. Trace the infrastructures of harm, but also the gestures and historias that confront them. And above all, resist the abstraction of suffering into policy categories, or God knows, like the creation of ethnographic vignettes. Emily's work reminds us that even in the aftermath of calamity, critique can indeed be recuperative. It can open up these kind of windows of transformation if we can train ourselves to look for them in the homes and kitchens of those whose lives we're privileged enough to come in contact with and to share a conversation or a meal. Jane Geyer once described anthropology as the examination of configurational thinking in moments of chaos, grief, loss, and determination to move forward. Malnutrition exemplifies that task. It asks us not to give up on progress, but to help articulate and extend the capacities that already exist in place. To map the everyday intersections through which seemingly intractable problems can be made proportionate to people's means of action. To ethnographically cultivate that hyphen, that malnutrition, or systems to pursue, helps us to pursue nourishment, not in solutions, to kind of create that space for reflection of the mal and malnutrition, and to abandon the kind of systems that are actually in search of a solution. We see, say, D, and instead kind of look for the forms of enduring solidarities that can offer. So that is, I think, the transformative vision for medical anthropology that malnutrition offers, and one that
very different.
Actually, some whiplash
No,
again.
crossover, I think, even though Emily, I don't know if you want to pick up on anything. Well,
It's so amazing to have my work read so carefully, and I hear your comments. I mean, what a gift to me to have you engaged with that so deeply. And I hadn't really thought about how I was writing this book during COVID with that kind of space of incredible uncertainty, and how now it's published and we're still in it. You know, that sense of they're quite different but similar kind of ground beneath. Guatemala just had 2 earthquakes yesterday, so I was thinking about earthquakes, but there is the sense of really the an instability of the ground beneath us. It's interesting. I mean, it's hopeful to think that maybe, I mean, did I really do that? I mean, but about kind of response to both the need to give kind of pragmatic, response to be, well, there is pragmatics in the method of attentiveness to the people that we're with, to our own positionality there. So hearing you kind of say that as a offering, it's certainly something I would hope that people get from the book. And also maybe even the pushback on that. I mean, there's in the to think some about your comments. There's always this kind of need to instrumentalize the interventions, and so even the kind of pushback on that staying with the work of staying with stories that book does. I often feel strange because I'm retelling what I've heard in the field. So these aren't really, I mean, they are my stories because they're translations from me, but it's like accumulated wisdoms from other people over and over and over again. What a privilege to have a field or a job where that be what we do. We listen and take what people say and get to kind of amplify it out through our writing. And but having that, the story can sometimes be unsettling, and can do that work where it doesn't have to get instrumentalized into, here's what the policy tool at the end is. It is like, oh, let's shift the way that we're thinking. I was going to add throughout, I mean, there is a, kind of for me an impulse to want to find lessons. What is the lesson in this? What is the thing that can be translated for students? And certainly you mentioned the sugar. So just on a pragmatic detail, one of the reasons that they back in 1968, when the study was being designed, ended up with the sugar, water, and protein instead of the initial design did have a placebo, and it was too expensive, so it was cut. And so sugar has come to the sugar water's Gatorade-like solution has come to stand in as the placebo. And that story of even this powerful study was also underfunded and not supported as much as it might have been to produce kind of better research out of it. I mean, I think it has since gained a kind of powerful life, but also people. It was one of the things that I try to attend to in the book is that I've interviewed many of the people involved in it, and it's not just a bad study. I mean, these are people that were trying to create an evidence base to show the importance for childhood feeding. And so they had this idea of, Johnson's War on Poverty had been launched, and, Head Start, there was kind of a desire to bring Head Start programs to schools, and they thought we could carry out research that will give an evidence base that will show the importance of early childhood feeding. And the kind of tragedy of the story becomes that it is actually can be used to undermine early childhood education, because as one of the scientists told me, by the time you're in school, it's too late. This kind of, the attention is in the desire to financialize and make everything, efficient in its investment. Then there's, I think, an emerging, beyond the first 1,000 days priority that kind of reproduces some of these flawed logics. But the idea was, well, school is too late. We really need to put your targeted bang for the buck investment in this period of kind of maternal fetal window. So so that I mean, there is a kind of lesson to be drawn of like, even back in this, what becomes a quite powerful study that is picked up and used and mobilized lots of energy and global health. It was, and this, wasn't prioritized, to fund sufficiently. Of course, funding that placebo study, having 6 villages instead of 4 villages wouldn't be an easy answer either, because it's still a US funded research project carried out in Guatemala, carried out, and another complexity though is carried out during a time that Guatemala was entering armed conflict, where people probably, an anthropologist, Luisa Madrigal, has studied some of the people that were part of the study. She's interviewed them and asked about their memories. And, there's a lot of people that have good memories of the study. But we also think the scientists themselves brought a degree of security to communities where just outside of these areas, there was armed conflict and active war. But, I think reconciling that sort of reconciling with, the kind of impossibility for the US government to be running, good aid programs at a time that the US government is funding genocide in Guatemala. I mean, that sort of that's happening kind of throughout the book, where there's like a little bit of good that's being done on a lot, kind of band-aid over a lot of real harm, and sort of figuring out, so is this attenuating it or amplifying it? It's certainly one of those kinds of messy spaces that both of the people sitting next to me, their research has kind of charted those kind of complexities and how we move forward through them. Is there something in specific I should that I didn't pick up on that you want me to?
Well, so one of the things I was really struck by in the book as well was, it's like you have this sort of pretty heart-rending story, and I mean it's enraging and hard to read at points. And then it's like, okay, what's the answer? Can you tell us the answer, please? So I mean, you do that at the end of it. And one of the things that, I mean, obviously I'm not really expecting you to come up with an answer, but I think one of the things that I really liked was your I wonder if you could say a bit more about your, the idea of being comfortable with, I'm going to mischaracterize it, so you'll have to correct me, but being comfortable with lots of different types of expertise, and that there isn't one solution or one way, and that there's, so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because I'm sorry, I'm having trouble summarizing it because it's quite complex.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I tell the story towards the end of the book of a girl running up to me in field work, asking for my help to get across the border where some people in her family live. And I had to say, like, I don't have that kind of power. And and so she turns around and walks away from me. And I'm thinking about, all the funding that I've raised to do my research and my position and my passport and my privilege and how I can't, I can't help this person in my field work with the thing that she needs more. I mean, it's complex, of course, but, and I had a Guatemalan, Tatiana Paz Limos, who said back to me, like, wait, you're acting as if you're responsible for this, and pointing out, like, that's a lot of the same flawed logic that exists and motivates and animates nutrition, that, that you can be responsible, like, even if you could provide her funding, it would run out. And she's one person, and there's like a whole system that needs to change. And sort of me sitting there with my feeling of like, what more can I do? How can I help more? What can I do to be more responsible? Tatiana says to me, like, that's not the way systemic change works. It doesn't work by like an individual. We're said this a lot in the United States, especially about like the drivers of social change. I just had a peer reviewer ask me, like, isn't individual change how all social change starts? And Tatiana's response is like, no, that's not the way social change works. Social change works by like putting yourself in collectives and being part of collectives, and putting yourself in good relations with people, especially those involved in collective actions and, union work, but those can be complicated too. So, but the idea is to really meticulously put yourself in good relations and a kind of very epistemic shift in what it is to be responsible is necessary in many ways to drive transformative relations. And I think that kind of, again, what I get to end the book with my own lesson there and what it would be to have a different orientation to collective problems.
I think, key things that you also show is that doing good relations or kind of animating those collectivities comes from how you think about the problem, right? You're going to animate a very different kind of collective group or kind of set of concerns or commitments if you're dealing with the problem of nutrition as a supplement issue, as opposed to kind of, a radical kind of rethinking of, capacity, human connection. For me, some of the work in malaria that I've done, the different kinds of publics that come around the issue of better improved housing as a means for intervening in malaria, as opposed to the distribution of bed nets. You're dealing with very different kinds of people. That's a relationship. So, I think one is the kind of how you use relations, but and this is, I do think where work like yours are kind of, anthropological thinking about how do we frame those problems, not in our kind of only or imaginative ways, but in ways that are already there, right? But that can catalyze some of that.
Yeah, let's open it up. We have a very diverse audience, so please.